Hello, and welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's my great pleasure to welcome today's program Rick Jordon, who is Senior Vice President and Regional Head of Logistics Americas at Panalpina. And today we're going to get his perspective as an executive in the 3PL industry on what's happening in the industry. Certainly there's a lot going on this year in particular, a lot of mergers and acquisitions taking place that's kind of transforming the landscape in terms of the types of services and that 3PLs are introducing into the marketplace. And certainly there's a lot of evolving things happening in the way 3PLs and customers work with one another. So, we're going to touch upon a lot of those topics today with Rick and kind of get his perspective on not only what's happening today, but what does the road ahead look like for the 3PL industry. I just want to remind those of you that joining us today that part of our goal here at Talking Logistics is to make this conversational. So if you do have a question or a comment for Rick as we're having our conversation here, you can do so via the submit a question button, and I'll take a look at those. And if there are any good questions that come in and we've got the time, I'll certainly try to weave them into the conversation. So with that, Rick, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Adrian. Happy to be here.
Rick, before we kind of dive into the topic, since you're a first-time guest here on Talking Logistics, I always like to ask, my guests, how and why they got involved in supply chain and logistics. So why don't we start there? Tell us a little bit about your career path, how and why you got involved with supply chain logistics, and kind of what your current role and responsibilities are there at Panalpina.
Sure. It's kind of a funny career path, if you will, in getting into the logistics space. I was actually an aerospace engineering major in undergrad for about half of my undergrad. And at some point decided I still liked airplanes and trucks and trains a lot. So when I was at Syracuse and getting my undergrad, found the logistics space very interesting and ended up getting a degree in logistics and leaving engineering behind. Took a couple years after that to get into the space around operations. Spent several years at General Motors in operations as a 3PL for one of their plants. After that, went into the technology space, number of years with Manugistics and several other startups. Right after that, went into Georgia Tech to get my grad degree, ironically in engineering, but in industrial and in international logistics, industrial engineering and international logistics. And then kind of focused on the 3PL and consulting space after that. A number of years in consulting, doing outsourced procurement, then M&A and bankruptcy work with Alex Partners, and now I'm here with Panalpina for the last 6 years. What my role here now currently is that I run the logistics product from Tierra del Fuego, Argentina, to the North Pole in Canada. So all the countries in between, with over 100 operations that we have running the local markets, and many of them have many of our global customers in several of those facilities.
Great career path. Some similarities with my own, background. I started in material science and engineering. That was my background. So it always, amazes me how many engineers, make their way to logistics after a while. I mean, I started in Motorola and doing semiconductors, so on and so forth. But I think the experience nonetheless, provides some great, foundational knowledge, particularly the analytical piece of it that engineers bring to the table, because that is becoming so critical here in the logistics and supply chain space. So let's talk about now the 3PL industry and what's happening. I mean, when someone asks you, hey Rick, what business are you in? What's your response today, and is it different than what it would have been, let's say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, it's funny. You say the word logistics now. It's far better understood than it was maybe even 5 to 10 years ago. Some of that I think as the Gulf War has developed over time, and seeing that people understood logistics based on a war, kind of ironic, if you will. But our business has completely changed. When I say I do logistics, if I see people get it by their reaction in their body language, then I can explain a little more detailed. If they don't know what logistics is, then I talk about the services that we provide of either manufacturing or changing the evolution of a product from either delivering it or picking it up at the factory or delivering it ultimately to someone's doorstep. And all the steps in between, or as long as 2 hours over a bottle of wine if you want.
Right. I
So
mean, go
uh,
ahead, continue.
I was just going to say, and it's funny how if I explained what I did 10 years ago, it was very transactional based, for the most part. Um, really talking about what did we do in A to B or B to C or C to D in the environment. Now, I talk about what we're doing, which is evolving into going up to manufacturing as well as the traditional 3PL logistics space. So it's certainly an evolving industry that we're in, and it's amazing to be part of this and just see how things have changed, even in the 20 years that I've been involved.
Right. I mean, I think, certainly, as I mentioned in my opening comments, I mean, there's been a lot of changes, obviously, not only this year, but really over the past few years in terms of mergers and acquisitions. And I've been talking about kind of part of that has been kind of this drive to kind of expand the footprint, the breadth and depth of the types of services that, 3PLs provide. And, certainly I think that's, from my perspective, one of the biggest changes that's taking place in the industry is that 3PLs are involved in so much more today than they were just even 5 years ago, and in many ways, many customers kind of view 3PLs as consultants in some cases. They view 3PLs as IT providers in other cases. I mean, do you see that as being the case?
Well, it's funny you say that because sometimes I'll get at conferences or phone calls, and I ask other people what they do. I'm in the 3PL space. If you really define, who is or is not in the 3PL space, it can be a long conversation as well, because I think if you include everyone from a freight pay company to a consultancy to a software provider to a transactional transportation provider, whether they're ground, rail, air, ocean, traditional warehousing, and then into some of the more value-added space. Every one of them consider themselves in the 3PL space. So first of all, getting your arms around what it really is a 3PL could be a very long and detailed discussion. So yeah, it's definitely as the industry has changed, everybody's in the 3PL space. But one of the things that's certainly going on that we all see every day right now is scale is becoming much more part of the value offering, because I either need to be in every major market or offer the breadth of services that my key competitors do, or frankly, I just won't be considered any longer in the target that I'm trying to deliver to.
Yeah, that's a great point about scale, and I think that brings up my next question, because I think scale is one of those things that a lot of customers and prospective customers are looking for. So from my perspective, I mean, a lot of the traditional focus around a 3PL, or one of the expectations, is operational excellence, right? But to me, in my perspective, operational excellence today is kind of the ticket to the dance. Meaning, just about any 3PL today, logistics service provider today, that has a long history behind them, has a brand name behind them. It's kind of assumed and expected that you're going to provide operational excellence. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in business anymore. So, I mean, do you agree with that operational excellence is kind of the ticket to the dance today? And if so, I mean, you mentioned scale. Is there other things that are important and that customers should look at when they're evaluating 3PL providers?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I 100% agree with you that operational excellence, if you don't perform at a level that is required or needed by the customer, you're not going to be performing very long for them. So that's certainly, I agree with you 100%. That's a ticket to the dance. The thing that, and as scale comes, there's also a danger in scale, in the sense of you can't be everything to everybody, in the sense of trying to offer every service to every market for every customer in every industry. It just doesn't work. It becomes problematic. So number one, I think when people look at who they're evaluating, look at the industries that they're in. Are they proven in the industries that they're already that they're in? For instance, if you're a consumer goods manufacturer, do they have a presence in consumer goods, or are they just an automotive provider? That's key, number one, because at the end of the day, success brings success, and if you've already been successful in an industry, the likelihood of higher success will come with that. Number two, I think one thing that we've spent a lot of time on, and I think this is becoming more and more questions that I see coming out of RFPs and when I'm in meetings, is people and retainment. Am I able to retain my talent? Number one. And what do I do to retain that talent? And on top of that, what do I do to keep them fresh? Because this isn't a transactional business any longer. And if I just focus on in and out moves, I'm not going to develop the talent that I need to really get to the next step, which customers really expect, not only today, but tomorrow and beyond. So, when we're looking for customers or looking to pursue a customer, I don't want a 2 or 3 year contract. I'd really look at something that's, 10 to 20 years, because that to me says success over a 3-year contract.
No, that's great. That's a great point. I think the people aspect, I mean, the talent piece is right on target. I mean, there's so much buzz today about there being a talent shortage. And it's a challenge not only for your customers, right, manufacturers and retailers and so forth, but it's also a challenge for 3PLs. And certainly that is a competitive differentiator for any 3PL that's able to position their talent as, people that bring industry experience, process experience, so on and so forth, and bring that to the table, I think is a very important value proposition.
And I'd like to add something. I mean, one of the things that I've really spent a lot of time developing, whether it's in my company or frankly, some of the universities and schools that I'm involved in, really getting to the core of, and it's a very cheap word, but it's also a very meaningful word, which is leadership. Is developing leadership skills and the ability to make decisions under pressure, because they go hand in hand. And frankly, not having to escalate every decision to a senior person in the company is a very valuable aspect of talent as we develop them. They have to be able to make decisions as things happen, and they can't wait to track me down if I'm on a 7-hour flight somewhere. They can't wait to track down their manager in some cases. So giving them the empowerment to make those decisions, but also having the confidence that they're going to make a decision under pressure and do the right thing. So I think that's all part of that leadership quality that I think is really something that as an industry, I see a lot of progress, but I think there's still a lot of work that can be done as well.
No, that's a great point. I know when I speak to supply chain logistics professionals, and the common thread I hear from them in terms of the biggest challenge that they face is not so much managing change, because change has always been the constants in supply chain and logistics, but it's managing the rapid pace of change. And one of the things that they deal with is, the recognition is that they need to be able to make smarter decisions faster. And part of that is to exactly your point, is being able to empower, folks across the organization, with the confidence and the knowledge and the skills to make those decisions, as quickly as possible, because in this rapid kind of environment, waiting hours or days, can set you back, significantly. So I think that's an excellent point you raised there. Let's talk about now, the relationship with customers. I've always been a big proponent of the vested model and really taking a more collaborative approach with your 3PL partners, right? Not view them as a supplier, but view them as a partner, so on and so forth. And we're seeing some progress there, but quite frankly, not enough. And in some cases, it's kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So I just want to, obviously not all customers are created equal. What attributes do you look for in a customer that says, hey, this could lead to a long-term successful relationship? And, conversely, what are some red flags that kind of say, what, this might not be a good opportunity for us from a partnership perspective?
Interesting question, because this one can also be a 2-sided question in the sense of offering up time. And what I mean by that is when we're pursuing or looking for a new customer, one of the best ways of judging how the relationship will go, in my mind, is the level of commitment at the executive level. And hands down, it is one of the most accurate predictors of success in the sense of whether I have enough time and whether my colleague on my customer level has enough time to meet on a regular basis. And what I mean by regular basis, it doesn't mean weekly or monthly, but at least we're in constant contact. We have the ability to meet face to face, set the right expectation level, set the right leadership level, because things in the trenches tend to get emotional at times, and being able to kind of sort out the fog from reality is always key. And having that person on the other side of that table that is always available, picks up the phone or returns a call on a regular basis, and frankly, from the beginning, are the ones that are involved, talk about their strategy, talk about their vision, what they're trying to do when we're pursuing new business, to me is the best barometer of predictive analysis that I could have on how well a customer will be moving forward.
That's a great point. I mean, one of the things that and I wrote about this recently, and Kate and folks at University of Tennessee have also been writing. This kind of troubling trend, if you will, of some shippers, some customers looking to kind of offload as much risk as possible, onto the 3PL, and I would say unreasonable amount of risk onto the 3PL. I mean, do you see that as well as that kind of a troubling trend in the industry, and how are you approaching it? Or how do you? I guess it goes back to your previous point in terms of the barometer you talked about, but just kind of your thoughts on that trend that we've been talking about.
Yeah, I've learned more about the legal side of the business and more about the insurance side of our business than I thought I ever would. But I think you're right. Managing risk has become a huge part of our business, because as we become more valuable to a customer, we also become more risky. If we're touching more product, then there's always the opportunity to talk about things around product liability or reliability, if you will. So if we're in a position where we're helping either sub-manufacturing or manufacturing something, we have to look into that. So risk is huge part of our business now, much more than just insuring a truck or a container or an airplane to make sure that a delivery made it from the warehouse to the door. That's certainly changed, but the risk side is managing that has become very, very much a critical element of our business. But I think you're also, you bring up another point there, is being able to manage the right risk and not taking on the wrong risks. For instance, how much inventory is in the building, how you value inventory. Things will go wrong, things will happen, and understanding when things go wrong and when things happen. Is there an escalation? Is there a governance model that manages that? And then, frankly, having set realistic limits on when things do go wrong. Both organizations do align on what happens. So there isn't that catastrophic event when we have the only color black in the world for a paint additive, and we're the only facility in the world that has that, and something happens to the facility and we shut down numerous automotive plants. That's the last thing that anybody would want to do. Last thing I would take on as a 3PL, being an exclusive for something of that nature, a popular color like black, as an example.
Right. Yeah. No. I think you touched upon what the critical elements there are. It's really having those conversations up front and really understand and having those relationships and trust in place to really and a governance structure to really know how both parties are going to work through some of these potential scenarios that can unfold. So let's talk now in the time that we have a little bit about the technology side, right? So technology is obviously playing a bigger and bigger role in supply chain and logistics in general, and obviously in the 3PL industry as well. You and I had a chance to meet and chat a little bit over at the JDA user conference earlier this year. First of all, tell me a little bit about how are the IT expectations from your perspective from customers changing, How are they different today than they were in the past in terms of what they're looking for from 3PL providers?
Well, interestingly enough, you mentioned earlier about operational excellence as kind of the ticket to the game. I think the second ticket, if you will, or the ability to go to the concession stand at the game is technology. If you don't provide robust technology in a way where it's reliable, as reliable or more reliable than our customers can do internally, and frankly, the ability to implement very quickly. Those are two key elements in the technology space that we see. And absolutely, if I don't have core technology, I don't even make it to the next round in an RFP or anything like that. So technology is critical element of our business. It's amazing how fast it's changing. It's getting easier in some levels, but it's getting more complex as well as we implement further up the value chain on doing some things around manufacturing. It's not just managing inventory in a warehouse any longer or managing a track and trace of a truck any longer.
Right. And when you talked about earlier about scale, certainly that is one of the key enablers, if you will, is the IT piece to be able to, enable that kind of growth and scale and be able to grow with the customer, if you will. And I think time to deploy, I think you brought that on. You mentioned that as well. I think that's one of the things I hear a lot from both the customers and the 3PLs. It's like, hey, we can't wait 3 months, 6 months, 9 months to deploy some kind of technology or some kind of, IT capability because the customer really, needs it tomorrow type of thing. Is that compression of time something you see as well?
Absolutely, but I think it's critical element here as well is it isn't all of the 3PL as well. I mean, we typically cannot get into the host systems where the data is coming from. Certainly, if we're doing visibility or if we're manufacturing or in a warehouse running a warehouse management system or a TMS on behalf of our customers, the data comes from somewhere. So we still need that cooperation on the other end. And I think this ties back to even an earlier question about how do we know success early on or not? And I think, just as importantly to having executive sponsorship is the other people that meet at the table, and certainly the technology staff of our customers usually are the ones that also dictate success or failure, if you will, in the sense of their presence, their ability to get what we need, and frankly, the quality of the work that they can provide. Because it goes back to the old adage, as when you were, in your past life back in the analyst world. I hate to use the term, but garbage in, garbage out. So the quality of data is always king to operating, operating excellence, if you will. So they're really, 1 and 1A in my book.
Oh, that's a great point. I remember years ago I did a research project where I interviewed a number of CIOs at 3PLs, and one of the more interesting findings from that research was that their IT teams were spending more than half of their time cleaning data. So when in the ideal world, they will be spending, more than 50%, if not the majority of the time on innovation and driving new developments, so on and so forth. They were really spending their time just cleaning and scrubbing data. And that, part of that was, they had to really develop better partnerships with their partners and others that were providing them with the data, because that was where a lot of the issues were coming from. So I think that's a great point that you brought up. Again, you were at the JDA conference. What kind of JDA solutions are you currently using, and kind of what factors led you to kind of choose them as a technology partner?
Sure. Currently, we use JDA's WMS. We use their TMS and their labor management tools. We have enjoyed a great opportunity with them. I think we have really hit our stride now in implementing these tools to what we need and what our customers require of us. I'll say there was a little bit of a learning curve that we went through as well on ramping up all of those tools, but we're at the point now where I'm very confident we can deliver on customer expectations. One comment there on customer expectations, though, is we're really trying to figure out the best way to standardize without trying to compromise, if you will, and that is standardize on some toolkits or some templates that we've developed without losing the ability to also customize, because at the end of the day, that's part of our business, is to do that. So there's always that trade-off. So it's a difficult task at times, but getting the customization down to a minimum is always best for us and best for the customer as well. To your point or question, why JDA, and it goes back to even what I'm just saying now about the templates and speed of execution. We historically in the past had several different platforms for each of the main pieces of our business, and we really took a long, hard look at is there a platform or two that we can standardize on, make those decisions, and then frankly, invest in those platforms. And that's really what we've done with JDA. We are now waning down of some of the other WMS systems we had. At one point, I think we had between customer requirements, acquisitions, and other things, 6 or 7 WMS systems in the Americas. So now we're down to really 2. One that's very specialized for the energy solutions business, and then JDA for a strong majority of the rest of our operations. We still operate a couple of systems on behalf of our customers, so we have to be able to manage that. But at the end of the day, a majority of our business is now on a standardized platform, which allows me to scale on that platform, scale the skill sets of the people that I have in our operations, and on top of that, deliver much quicker to the customer and getting value delivered to them on a much compressed timeline than in the past.
No, I think you brought some great points there. Kind of a related question here, because this is something that is kind of an ongoing discussion in the industry, right? Is whether do you partner with a best of breed or a third party technology provider, something like a JDA, or do you kind of develop your own proprietary solutions? And I think you continue to see kind of different service providers take one or both paths there. I mean, do you see a continued role in terms of, or value in terms of developing your own proprietary solutions? Do you see that as a potential competitive differentiator, or do you see that as something that if it's better off going with a third party provider that's whose core business is developing technology?
Interesting question, because it brings up a lot of debate internally when we are looking at, I think the key question there is how do you differentiate, especially in the 3PL space. One of the things that we've had several long discussions on in the past is if we do in fact create our own in-house solutions, then we really are differentiating from anyone else who may be using the same solution that we currently use. So that's always the debate. I've looked at the downside to that, and again, from my background of being in this space for a long period of time, and also have enjoyed working with the technology providers and actually working for them at some point in my career. The dilemma you really run into is when you write your own system, typically they're great out of the gate. They really are differentiators. As people that have developed those move on in their career, whether they move up in the organization or move out of the organization, you lose a huge piece of that knowledge base. And over time, that proprietary system becomes more and more difficult to operate because you've lost that knowledge base over time. So I can see both sides of the argument on this one, but my opinion is certainly I try to standardize as much as possible and use as much as possible that's already been developed over years, rather than trying to create green fields. But I think there will be, as we move forward, as you mentioned, change is inevitable in our industries. I think there will be continued opportunities where either as a 3PL we will create a new piece of software for some piece of the supply chain, or frankly you'll see startups that will do it, and then like they have in the past, just like our industry, there's been an awful lot of consolidation in that market. So startups will come up, they'll create a new piece of software, and somebody will like it and probably gobble them up.
Right. No, great insight and perspective on that. And like you said, this is something that you can really make strong arguments on both sides of. There's pros and cons and strong arguments on both sides of that question. Rick, we're kind of coming up short on time here, so I'll just get to my last question here. I started off by asking you, how would you answer the question, what business are you in today? Well, let's fast forward, let's say 5 or 10 years from now, and if you were asked that question, what business are you in? How do you think your answer would be different, 5, 10 years from now, and what impact, what consequences will that have on 3PLs, IT providers, and customers?
No, it's a fun question that we will often brainstorm with my teams on is, what does our business look like 5, 10 years from now? Because, if we're not thinking about it now, we're going to be left behind. Certainly, I think as populations tend to return back to the cities, especially in, North America, not, in Asia and other places, that, that's becoming the norm. I think you're going to see more and more localized manufacturing just to be closer to the consumer, and how we support that business is going to be key. Whether it's providing raw material moves into those smaller but localized factories, if you will, or assembly locations, or we, as the 3PL provider, become that assembly provider at the same time. And we're already doing that on a larger scale, and I see that continuing where, I wouldn't be surprised where we are manufacturing or assembling things that typically, 3PLs didn't do in the past. I mean, certainly automotive, it's been an area where 3PLs have been doing light assembly and sub-assembly for a long period of time. But I think the electronic space is ripe for this, where, the typical outsourced manufacturers and logistics providers, I think you'll see over the next 5 to 10 years become a single provider. And, who will survive and who will get gobbled up, that's going to be, a fun dilemma over the next 10 or 15 years. But that, to me, I think is going to be one of the key changes, as well as, I think, other large things like white goods. And I don't know if the scale of manufacturing them in 1 or 2 locations globally makes sense any longer. And maybe the opportunity to manufacture at a local level, closer to consumer. Fuel inevitably will go back up. We're not going to enjoy $40 a barrel oil for forever. So I think that will drive a lot of these elements. In addition, I think space you're seeing becoming a critical element as well, a capacity element, where availability to the key markets, the cost of that warehousing or operational space is becoming one of the key contributors to how you are, whether you're profitable or frankly, not making the target profit you need.
Great food for thought, and things to consider as folks are looking ahead into the future and the impact of the industry. Well, Rick, like I always say at the end of every episode, we always manage to scratch the surface on these topics, but certainly enjoyed your perspective and thoughts on what's happening in the 3PL industry today, and what might unfold in the years ahead. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today.
Adrian, thank you. And like you could probably see, I could probably go on for 3 more hours, but anytime, I'm more than willing to help out. Thank you.
Great. Well, I appreciate that. Again, thank you, Rick, for your time. Thank you, those of you that joined us live today. We didn't get any questions for Rick, but if you are watching this episode on demand and you do have a question or a comment for Rick, you can find this episode on talkinglogistics.com, and you can post a question or a comment there, and I'm sure Rick will be more than happy to respond via that medium. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.